podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome to No Question About That, and today a new show we're calling United Inc., all about Manchester United's financials. With me today, very special co-host, Jamie, also known as Subprime Goals on Twitter. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm looking forward to getting into all the fine details.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoy your Twitter feed with a breakdown of all the financials and just the clarity that you're giving to a topic that is widely misunderstood, I think. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about the top line, Manchester United's revenue and profitability, those two things going in different directions. We can talk about that. We'll talk about the stadium, new stadium, and routes to funding, which is, I don't know about you, that's been left wide open by Sir Jim and Barada. They're not giving any details on that one. And then we'll talk a little bit about transfers and PSR and where United might be. Our best guesstimate, anyway, which is all it can be. All right, let's talk top line then. Where are United in terms of revenues, cash on hand, profitability at the moment?
Yeah, so in terms of like the headline numbers, obviously United have been in a pretty dire financial straits over the last 3 or 4 years. Jim's been talking about that an awful lot recently, or Sir Jim, we should probably call him.
Big Sir Jim.
Big Sir Jim. So yeah, where are we looking in terms of the 24-25 season? So that's the season that we're currently in. So if you take the guidance that United put out there to the New York Stock Exchange, they should be making around about 660 million in terms of revenue. Alongside that, they should have about 740 million in operating costs. So that number includes the wages of all of the staff, including the players, includes the amortization, and includes all the other costs that go towards running the club. So whether that's stadium costs or audit fees, all of that sort of good stuff. That means that in terms of operating losses, otherwise known as EBIT, and we can dive into that if the football finance nerds really want to know about that.
Yeah.
Well, that's an operating loss of about 80 million pounds. If you that includes some exceptional costs. So the much talked about cost to fire Ten Hag, also remove Dan Ashworth, and then also the costs that come with the unfortunate redundancies that have been going on over the past year. If you remove those, that then means your underlying loss is actually about 50 million pounds. Now, I remember that number because we're going to come back to it. Those numbers I just talked about also don't include things like player sales. So the profit that we book in terms of when we sell players like Scott McTominay. The reason why I'm starting here is because United often get talked about as the world's biggest, the world's richest club. The reality of the situation is that the historic decisions that have been made strategically kind of means that that's not actually the case anymore.
Certainly true. In fact, if you look at the Deloitte Money League, United are down to, 5th or something like that now, well behind Real Madrid. I mean, 400 million euros or so in terms of top-line revenue behind Real Madrid.
Totally. And I remember the days growing up when it was always a question of, was it United or was it Real Madrid on top? There's a lot of work to be done, I think, to get United back to that position. And I think the other thing to note here is this won't happen overnight. That's one thing I do agree with Big Sir Jim on. It's this will take a number of years to really course correct the ship, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of current situation, about an underlying operating loss of about 50 million pounds. Now, why is that important? It's because I think actually we might be starting to see light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the financial picture beginning to slowly improve. Doesn't mean that there's going to be a big war chest for transfers. There's lots of contingencies on that, which we'll get onto. But if you think about the cost savings that have been made, the pretty stark cost savings, they're going to total, I think, around about 50 million at a minimum.
Yeah.
So they've already announced the cost cuts in the first half of this year, which was, I think, around 40 to 45 million. They've got another round of redundancies that have been announced, but the guidance for those cost savings haven't come yet. I think minimum it's going to be 50 million.
Yeah.
So
did Sir Jim not give a bigger number than that? And there was a little bit of debate about what that bigger number really was in one of his interviews last week. And really, he was talking about also player sales and wage savings and that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah. So I think there have been a lot of numbers flying around. I try and just take what the club have actually said in their financial report, and then a little bit of cautious guesstimates. I think sometimes when you speak in the press, you mix certain things together, and then that's when you start to get blurred lines. But let's take the 50 million as kind of like a baseline. That then wipes out for next season that underlying loss, right? Now, you obviously have got the Europa League, which, if you take into account the prize money and the gate receipts, is about 40 to 45 million thus far. Obviously, assuming United don't win it. Let's be cautious. I'd like to not be, but we'll see. They've then also, if they don't win the Europa League, they're not going to have about £8 million coming from the Adidas sponsorship deal.
Yeah.
So altogether,
and that's the discount that Adidas have demanded as part of that new contract. So, so in fact, the new contract was, I guess, more punitive than previously, because last year didn't count, but this year or next year will, if we don't win the Europa League, in terms of that 10 million euros discount per year that we're not in the Champions League, something like that.
Yeah, $10 million, £8 million. And it's kind of interesting that Adidas are also kind of taking that approach with other teams as well. They recently announced, alongside Liverpool, they're going to be their new kit sponsor. And there are some pretty punitive elements related to that, which is effectively contingent on performance of the team.
Yeah.
So that's not unique to United, but something to bear in mind because it's not insignificant. So that means potentially with no Europe, you're going to be losing around £50 million in terms of top line. So, okay, where is that going to be made up from? Well, we've got lots of contracts that are expiring in terms of player contracts, the likes of Lindelof, Eriksen, etc. And by all accounts, it feels like that those contracts aren't going to be renewed. Yeah. That's about £22 million of savings, which, okay, are going to be reinvested. And then you've got Jadon Sancho. Now, I know there's a bit of debate as to whether...
Yeah, Jadon, thanks for helping us out there, mate. You've done really well. University hated at Chelsea now.
Oh, he's got his freedom, right?
Yeah.
So if you take into account the incremental wages that could be saved next year if the obligation to buy does come to fruition, and the fees that we'd get from him, and the saving on amortization, actually, if you combine those numbers with the expiring contracts, you're actually then saving 50 million.
Yeah.
So actually, a lot of these costs would be absorbed. And I think the worst case scenario, you're kind of looking at like break even to small losses before taking into account player sales.
Well, and if you think about what might be needed, if United don't win the Europa League, we're going to have way fewer games next season. And they will play, maybe Amorim can play with a smaller squad anyway. And even if that's one or two players, that like bridges some of the gap there.
No, totally. And, when we're thinking about youth and the ability to blood through a bit more youth with that squad structure that you've talked about, I think there are some pros that come from it. You also do save on costs because you're not having to operate the ground during match days as well.
Woohoo! Yeah, the price of failure is we don't have to operate the ground during match days. Yeah, all right. Let's talk a little bit about profitability here, because it sort of came up in the press quite a bit, and Sir Jim has talked about it. 5 years of losses in a row, eye-watering numbers, well over £300 million lost, stuck on the corporate credit card. Yeah. Thank you, corporate daddy, for charging us 10% interest on that as well. Awesome. So, just how much have United lost over the last few years?
Yeah, so look, the numbers that Jim's quoted in terms of the 300 million plus of losses are absolutely correct. And I think you brought into like the cash position as well. I think that's the other part of the equation here, which is incredibly important. And as you know, something I've been writing about for ages. So the size of United's credit card facility is 300 million pounds. Thank you to the corporates lending us that money. On the last set of results, so this is the period up till the end of 2024 calendar year, United had 96 million pounds of cash in the bank, and they only had an additional 90 million left on that credit card facility. So in other words, really, United are living on their credit card. And don't forget, Jim has put in his $300 million, 250 odd million pounds, depending on what exchange rate you use. So this is where it's kind of like they're still having to play very fine balancing act in terms of how they manage their cash, and actually then how does that link to the profits or losses at the moment that they're currently making.
Yeah.
I think that, as hard as it has been, I think particularly on the non-playing staff side, that to me has always felt like the end goal, which is, okay, look, we are going to be changing the squad, reducing the wage bill of the squad, but that takes time. I think there was look, if I put my finance hat on and not my fandom hat on, there was a financial imperative to make some quick moves. They've definitely been heavy-handed with that. And I think when they'll look back on their first year, what were the learnings? I'm sure that will probably come up.
Yeah.
Or you would hope.
I mean, do you not think this is a lot of this is like, so Jim did his chemical engineering degree, spent quite a bit of time in private equity. This is a very, very familiar model for anyone who's worked in the PE world. You roll up a bunch of companies, you make pretty drastic cost savings. There's a playbook, and a very familiar playbook all of the time. And he's basically rolled this out into United, which is like, I think it got a lot of us a bit freaked out because it's hard to find examples of clubs that have cut their way to success. That's not really where we're at in football. But as a business, you're losing so much money. So Jim has looked at this and gone, this is unsustainable. There's only so much cash I can or I'm willing to put in. And before like PSR limits are breached, I mean, he can put as much cash in as he likes if he just wants it to be loans or equity or something like that. But there's challenges there as well. So you can kind of get where he's come from, even if it is being brutally hard.
No, totally. And I think I might just be being completely optimistic here, but some of the things that he was saying in this latest round of interviews and kind of press tour indicated that he'd learned a little bit.
Yeah.
If I'm taking again, slightly more optimistic view on ticket prices, there was the reports that it was going to be 20% and it ended up being 5%. Maybe they are learning as they go along, which is what you have to do. But I think every opportunity that people around them have to remind them of like how football does operate and that it's not just like any other business, I think is only going to help the cause long term. I think that it feels like they're learning, but they can't learn quick enough.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously they've run Lausanne for a few years and then Nice, made a bunch of mistakes with both of those as well. I mean, got relegated with Lausanne and he put his brother Bob in charge. And Nice has had some challenging times until really the last 2 years or so. But it might be the same sport, but they're different branches of the same religion, aren't they, really? And Manchester United just a very different, like Manchester United's revenue is bigger than the entire French League's TV contract, right? So it kind of puts it into perspective, like how different this is. And I think a lot of the mistakes have been down to just not getting it. I mean, you listened to the interview I did with Duncan Drasdo from Must and Andy Green yesterday. And I think they gave the impression that through the negotiations with Sir Jim and team, that they've learned something.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be a continual process, right? Like there's going to be loads of things that they learn about how the fan base thinks about the club. When we go through the consultation period for the new stadium, they put out the surveys about which statues go where. Like it's more than that.
Yeah.
You know, it's when we're actually walking through the stadium, what are the things that actually fans need to keep to make it truly feel like home and not the soulless bowl that everyone is afraid. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I'm old enough that I've seen 3 stands at Manchester United change. So, I mean, 3/4 of the ground is different than it was in 1992. So change is perpetual, even though fans hate it. More than any subset of humanity, right? Fans hate change, except when it comes to transfers. We love change then.
Yeah, exactly. We're fine being ruthless in that regard. If a player's not good enough, that's it, go.
This episode is brought to you in association with NordVPN. For those of you who don't know, VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. It secures your connection, protecting your personal information and online activity, especially on public Wi-Fi. The VPN enables your phone or laptop to switch its virtual location to another country, which is great for accessing your favorite content while you're traveling. Long-time listeners will know that I've spent a good part of the last 20 years on the plane. I've recorded this podcast in places from Tokyo to Old Trafford, New York to the Northern Quarter, and a VPN has been absolutely essential to watching the game while I'm abroad. True story. I once racked up a £1,500 phone bill watching a United game while I was in Shanghai. I was on my work phone and I blamed it on video calls back to the office. The key lesson of this story is not how to scam your employee out of a large phone bill, but that I couldn't have watched the United game without a VPN. It's been a real lifesaver. If you want to try NordVPN for yourself, go to nordvpn.com/NQAT, and our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. It's the best discount available and equivalent to the price of coffee per month. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link is also in the podcast show notes if you need it. We've touched on the stadium. This is really interesting because I think they basically said in public they think it will be about 2 billion. Good luck with that, lads, because no large infrastructure project ever comes in on budget or on time, and 5 years away. So let's just take them at face value. £2 billion cost. And so Jim kept saying it will be Manchester United's money. It's Manchester United's money, which kind of suggests when we talk about the areas of financing, exactly where this is likely to focus, and it's going to be controversial. So let's talk a little bit about that. £2 billion. How do we finance it? There's debt, there's equity, there's private finance, there's naming rights, and property deals, and that is probably going to be the mix. Let's talk about some of those.
Cool. So first one, and I'll take this one because I think it's relatively straightforward. On things like naming rights and advertising, look, I think it can happen. I just don't think it's going to be part of the initial slate of funding. Why would you do this right now when United are not playing anywhere close to their best? And as a advertising opportunity, it's just not really there. So I think when it comes to the costs at the end, in terms of if there are overruns, I think that's where that could be helpful. In terms of equity, well, you could look at existing shareholders or new shareholders.
Any of those willing to put money in? Have you noticed over the years?
I mean, I think it's probably a safe bet that the Glazer family will not be putting any money into this. As everyone has commented, they've been surprisingly absent in terms of putting their name to the new stadium, which people are reading into for all various reasons.
Wouldn't that be magical? Just the last fuck you if Joel Glazer called it the Joel Glazer Memorial Stadium or something like that. Yeah, it won't happen, but oh my God.
Yeah, I think people might have a few things to say about that. Obviously, could Sir Jim put some money in himself? I think potentially, but I think there is obviously things that have to happen before that. He's just not, the way the deal has been structured, he is not incentivized to put in any money until he has more, if not all, of the Glazer shares.
Yeah, it's a very difficult conundrum, isn't it? Because if he puts money in, he boosts the value of the club. So if he financed, let's say, 500 million of this stadium himself, not through equity, but private financing, he's just boosted the value of the club, and therefore the negotiations with the Glazers over the takeover later, which is kind of got a price, but kind of not.
Yeah.
would be even more difficult. Like, it's a really challenging situation he can afford it. He literally can afford it, but it's just a really difficult structure for him to actually do that.
Totally. And I think that's where, if we think about new equity partners, that's where it could get interesting. So you could have you could set up the stadium to be its own entity but owned by Manchester United. So United still own the stadium, but you could have direct investors coming in to purely fund certain stages of the project. And that's something that Everton did. So Everton set up a separate company whilst the stadium was being built.
Yes, they got into some trouble with that, though, because there was an argument with the Premier League around those interest costs and whether they could be counted against PSR or not.
Well, I think on that point, that then I think comes into debt. So we may get onto that in terms of how the debt might be structured. I think just to stick on the equity structure, the other alternative is that, look, if the Glazers are not going to put money in, then there'll probably be a question as part of the negotiation, which is, well, should they get the benefit of the upside that a new stadium would bring, or should that be someone else who is willing to be a shareholder of Manchester United and fund the stadium?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of like, in my eyes, just looking at it, those feel like the two options that are potentially on the table. And obviously,
well, let's dig into that with a little bit of detail then. So a third party comes along, says, I'm willing to put £500 million into this project. New Trafford Inc. is the holding company which owns the stadium, and that is owned by Manchester United PLC, or whatever corporate structure there is in the Cayman Islands.
Yeah.
And therefore, this third party gets some part of the revenues back as part of some kind of structured financing deal from this new company. So it's the uplift from the stadium and they get a rev share of that. Or you could, if you were Barcelona, could call it a lever of some nature, right?
Yeah.
Who could those parties be, and what sort of size of private financing are we thinking about?
Well, I mean, look, to keep things simple, 50-50 United financed and a third party financed. Look, it could be any mix, but I think if Sir Jim views this as kind of a key part of Manchester United's future, I can't see how they would allow anyone else to finance more than 50% of the stadium build. So that's 1 billion each. In terms of what that, for a new investor, what would that cost look like? Well, it's the £1 billion of the stadium, and then it's a combination of potentially equity that they want to take from probably the Glazer family. The share structure is not particularly attractive in the fact that there are two different types of shares which have different levels of voting rights. So I think if you had another investor come in, they'd probably have to buy a chunk of both types of share classes. But just to keep things simple, we'll focus on the Glazer family. In terms of those numbers, like Joel and Avi, let's treat them as one party, and then all the other siblings as another party. I would say, based on the information that is out there in the prospectus, there's an indicative price range of like $33 per share, which is what Jim bought it for. There was also, I think, when Sir Jim originally put his offer in, there was like an option for up to $36. So if you use those as kind of like a bound in pricing, Joel and Avi's shares are worth somewhere between 800 and 860 million pounds. The rest of the family is 1.4 to 1.5 billion pounds. So for a new investor coming in, you're looking at minimum of like 2 to 3 billion pounds to buy into this. One for the shares, one for the funding, and then the rev share on top of that. So you're looking at some pretty serious players, I think, in terms of third parties. And there would be no I don't think there'd be a shortage of people who'd be interested.
No, and both high net worths or ultra high net worths in this case, but also institutional capital. There were a whole bunch of private equity funds that looked at United during this process and just didn't bid up because, Sir Jim is paying nearly 3 times as much as the market cap at the moment. Which is fine, because United basically behaves like a private company, even though it is not, right? Because it's so majority held by the families or these individual, or it's a gym as well now in this case. So we've got some private financing, some equity, but that's difficult until there's a full takeover.
Debt, yeah. So the spectre of debt, and yeah, you mentioned earlier the podcast with Must, and I think it was Andy that said this. I think he hit the nail on the head in terms of, look, United cannot afford £2 billion worth of debt as a club, and so I think this is where, when you get into the intricacies of what a deal might look like, I think clearing the Glazer debt, so to speak, for want of a better phrase, will be paramount to give capacity for, I'll use this in air quotes, good debt. So, debt that's used to build an asset and ultimately generate revenue, which is predominantly going to go back in towards the club. So what might that debt look like? If you look at the private debt market, typically the premium above interest rate is somewhere between 400 and 500 basis points. That means that, if you take current, say, Bank of England interest rate of 4.5%, you're looking at somewhere between 8.5% and 9.5%. So on £1 billion worth of debt, you're looking at £100 million of interest. Pretty hefty, and obviously more than what the club is currently paying. And I think even on pretty, I wouldn't say optimistic is probably the wrong words, but on pretty positive assumptions, in 3 years' time, are United going to be able to generate 100 million in operating profit from the break-even point of next year? Like, the team really do have to perform well and get into the Champions League and et cetera, to really kind of facilitate that.
That is the challenge, isn't it? Because everyone looks at the debt, and it's not just the top line number. It's like, okay, how much revenue can you make to justify that additional cost? And maybe, Arsenal are nearly up to United's annual matchday revenue. I mean, this is a different topic. I don't think they were ambitious enough when they built the Emirates. They built what they could afford, but it hasn't generated enough revenue really yet to justify it. Spurs, different question, right? £1 billion worth of debt, borrowed at the right time when money was basically free, and they've got this fantastic asset as a result, and they'll be in a really strong position in a few years' time. Yeah. And Sir Jim has kind of looked at that, I think, and gone, ambition. Like, because United could build 100,000 seater stadium or 85,000 seater, and it be kind of less ambitious in design wise, construction costs, all of that, property deals and stuff. But I suspect they've taken a lesson there and gone, it has to be really good to generate those big numbers, which is what is happening at Barcelona and Real Madrid with Camp Nou and the Bernabeu. As ambitious as you can get, basically.
And I think also, I think that's a really important point, because it links to this third-party investors, right? Like, unless you're ambitious, why would another party come in and help, right? And I think on that point as well, when you look at recent examples of debt funding, there is potentially some room to get a little bit more optimistic about what the interest rate could be. Everton are in the process, I think, of refinancing. If not, they may have already refinanced some of their stadium debt. And they've got like a fixed 7.4% interest rate. They're also not in a great financial position. So there's potentially some room to play with on the interest rate, which will make a big difference, I think, to the team. I think also one thing I've learned recently is the interest payments don't necessarily kick in until the stadium build is finished. So there is a 5, potentially 7-year window to kind of get yourself and have a little bit of buffer and get yourself into the position where you could make that much profit.
Yeah.
I've heard Goldman Sachs recently, there was a report saying that Goldman Sachs are helping Barcelona to refinance their stadium.
Again.
And Barcelona, I think that's the one where I'm going to be paying quite a lot of attention to, because obviously Barcelona, as you mentioned, are in a probably even worse state than us in terms of financials. And so if their interest rate is somewhat favourable, I think that could lead to a slightly more positive outcome.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? But with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers, a network of 130 million of them, in fact. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, and did I say job title? See how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Well, there's some irony with Barcelona because La Liga is so strict on financials and kind of has controlled their playing budget for 3 or 4 years now. If the same rules applied in the Premier League, United would have made the Sir Jim level cuts 3 years ago. I mean, they'd been looking at financial losses. The Premier League would have said, can't do that. And there'd have been some severe cuts. So, the laissez-faire attitude of Premier League regulation, well, there's not very much of it, has kind of led United to some bad financial behaviours, I'd say. But
totally.
Yeah. All right. So some mix of debt, equity, private financing will be playing in the Aramco Old Trafford Mega Bowl or something like that. Or of course, Ineos could decide to take out those naming rights if they wish to. Yeah.
They're exiting other sporting marketing ventures, aren't they?
The interesting thing with Ineos, of course, they're well used to these massive infrastructure projects. They're building a huge chemical plant, Europe's largest chemical plant in Antwerp right now. So Jim's complaining about the unions there because he wanted to fire a bunch of staff. Yeah, lovely. And they built a $5 billion plant in Saudi Arabia as well. Another refinery there. So, these mega infrastructure projects are kind of well within the scope of understanding, I'd say. I mean, maybe chemical plants, but and they look very similar. Ineos is highly leveraged, but works on this kind of low margin, highly leveraged model, heavy capital assets and all of that. So there you go. Maybe they'll understand how to do this. Touch wood.
Well, we can live in hope.
We can. Yeah. All right. And then we come on to the kind of third section of our pod today, which is talking about transfers and PSR. This is the one that everyone is always most interested in. First, I guess, how close were United to breaching the PSR for the last cycle? I mean, it looked like there was about a £40 million COVID exceptional cost that the Premier League allowed through, which everyone was a little bit, how exactly was it so large?
Yeah, and look, I can understand that I won't go into that in too much detail, but the one thing I would say is that United are bigger than most clubs. So when you're thinking about allowable costs, they're likely to be bigger than other clubs. And ultimately, all the other Premier League clubs had to agree to it in order to get the exception. So, look, I think they were last year pretty close. I think like within somewhere between a £5 to £10 million margin, which is very uncomfortable. Linking back to what we talked about at the start, I think going forward, PSR in the traditional sense will be less of an issue. And I think there's a few things to probably dig into here to just explain that comment a bit more. So in the current guise of PSR, there's really kind of like two financial elements to it. So it's your profit and loss. So how much profit or losses are you making from your football operations? There's also a second bit, which is on cash flow, which is if you owe another club money for a transfer, you cannot defer that payment at all. You have to pay it on time. So I think United were probably pretty close on last year. I think they were pretty close on the losses element. I think, we talked about at the top, the cash flow element. I think that's still an element which they're going to have to be very, very careful about, particularly if sales don't come through as I think, is being widely reported. When we look so that's the kind of current position. As we look forward, we're going to have one more year at least of these current rules. That's why getting to break even, which we talked about at the top of the show, is so important because it just gives more capacity to spend.
Yeah.
That the cash flows will come to give them the ability to spend. And then going forward, the really important thing is going to be something called the squad cost ratio, which is effectively what's the ratio of all of your player wages and the kind of proportional share of the transfer fees each year as a proportion of your revenue. So in UEFA, they already have this for European competitions in place, and the limit is 70%. You can't spend more than 70% on player wages.
Well, 80% this year and 70% next, I think. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I think in terms of how close were they, very close. Going forward, I don't expect there to be that much of an issue. I think the pinch is going to be just on this cash flow point, right? Jim mentioned that there was £89 million that's going to be going out the door in the summer for historic transfers. Remember, there's only £96 million in the bank at the moment, right? Now that will get boosted up by things like season ticket payments coming through the door, but it kind of shows that things are still pretty tight. And I think when we're thinking about the transfer window coming up, even with United potentially winning the Europa League and qualifying for the Champions League, I would expect them to still be operating on a pretty tight, we're going to sell before we buy sort of scenario, because they're not, everything that they're doing at the moment doesn't indicate that they're going to just turn the taps on and everything's okay.
Well, we should explain a little bit this change from PSR to squad cost and why it didn't come in this year, because it was supposed to come in or for next season. Yeah. And the Premier League clubs voted against it. I think some of that is to do with they haven't agreed exactly what the multiple on the floor is, right? So there's, along with the squad costs, whether it's 70% if you're in Europe or 85% if you're not in Europe, which fucked everyone in the Conference League, or the one or two English teams that were going to be in that, the worst possible position to be in. But then there's this idea that the maximum you can spend on your squad is a multiple of 5 times the lowest club's broadcast income, which would work out at £550 million or something like that. It seemed like the Premier League clubs didn't agree this. Am I right in thinking that there was some kind of argument about whether they would bring this in or not?
Yeah, and I think the two clubs, interestingly, that were probably most against this were the two Manchester clubs, from everything that you hear. And there's an element of I do somewhat get the consternation about it, which is you're trying to incentivize Premier League clubs to grow revenue, but then you're saying, well, okay, don't invest that money.
Yeah.
And I think there's bigger conversations about distribution of income, not just in British football, but I think more broadly across Europe. And I think, look, the big thing for me is I think the squad cost rule is a good rule. I think there's obviously fine details that need to be combed through as it's applied specifically to the Premier League. But I think if you look at all of the Premier League clubs, pretty much, bar one or two exceptions, the thing that is driving the big losses is player wages and transfer fees. Yeah. And there is, I think there needs to be a unified way to look at that across Europe and potentially global football to control that a little bit, because, the thing that I've always pondered about, when I'm really bored is, how long can football just be propped up by effectively rich businessmen, or in some cases states? And is it right that football clubs are huge loss-making entities? I think you can still get a lot of the positives of what a football club can offer society and communities, just without having to rack up huge losses, even if they're break even.
It's the ultimate competitive industry, isn't it? You've got United competing with 19 other Premier League clubs and another 80 odd across Europe that all want to be in the Champions League. And that is like, if you went into your supermarket and there were 80 flavors of Coke there, none of them would be very profitable, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's what football does. And so you have this constant tension between, okay, we need to rein it in a little bit. So UEFA or the Premier League, this is where you get PSR type regulations saying everyone's going to compete themselves down to making losses because it's an arms race constantly. So we've got to kind of control it. And then you've got the European Union and the players basically going, there's no way you're capping our wages, which is basically what the squad cost rule does. It just in different wording. And it's this constant tension, which is why, and the different topic, but with the government regulator coming in, and I think you've got 72 clubs in the Football League who are basically looking at that going, more money, but without squad cost. any kind of cost controls on that, it's just going to be like the prune juice of Alan Sugar fame. It shouldn't go straight through all the clubs out into player wages, and you'll just get a boost in player wages in for some League Two cloggers. Like, does that make sense or not? It's a good question for football overall, isn't it?
Yeah, because I think, look, you've got this, as you put it, this constant tension. You know, if you're outside of the Premier League, really, most clubs, again, barring, say, like a Brentford or a Brighton, have effectively spent their way to get into the Premier League.
Yeah.
If you don't stay in the Premier League...
Mind you, Brighton did as well. I mean, £500 million pounds, Tony Bloomsbury.
Yeah, that's fair. Like, they did spend a lot of money, but I think...
But now they're profitable, yeah.
And they have also spent a lot of money in infrastructure. I mean, like the fact that Chelsea have done what
funded
they've
their
done,
stadium.
Exactly. I think says everything. But Brentford, when you're thinking about football's data revolution, seem to be a good benchmark. And obviously that's something where I think Sir Jim is obviously clearly focused on. And to bring it back to United, when we're thinking about that operating cost element, that 710 million underlying, is there a way in which you can mitigate natural inflation in that and just continue hiring good people to run a football club?
Absolutely. I mean, every industry is now looking at how you implement data and AI into their operations to strip out humans. I know this in great detail. And for sure, how much more efficient can you be with your operations, with your data, and how can you play the transfer market in a much better way? And the fact that United are signing a lot of young players, presumably, and even mentioned some data points in their press release about Patrick Dorgu. It was mocked by real data nerds, but like points the way to how United are starting to think, and we are a decade behind Liverpool, Brentford, City, and a bunch of other clubs in that way of thinking. Totally,
and I think it's also, I think it's just accelerated by our current financial position, right? Like, the fact there is an immediate benefit to going through this strategy. United's amortization bill is running at over £200 million.
Yeah, unsustainable.
Exactly. That's a third of your revenue gone immediately, effectively on transfers over time. I think as we're looking towards this summer, all the indications are that I think it's going to be a similar sort of thing. I think there will be still marquee players that are signed. As we look 2 years ahead, Bruno, as much as I love him, and I'm sure you do as well, Ed, like, will he be able to sustain what he's doing for another few years? He's going to have to be replaced. If we're not buying that person or a couple of players now, you're probably going to have to spend big to replace him when that time does come.
Yeah, I mean, they will. I mean, it kind of brings us to the transfer strategy this summer, doesn't it? I mean, if it looked something like good forward that may be young, may not be young, plus a bunch of younger Patrick Dorgu style signings, depending on who's out the door. Let's just assume that Anthony, Casemiro, Rashford, and Sancho are all sold in a
Malacia,
optimistic. And Malacia is gone. Yeah. I mean, and even make a profit on him on the books. Amazing, really, given that he's had no legs for the last 2 years. So, like, optimistic scenario, all those players go, plus Eriksen and Lindelof, and maybe another or two, depending. If it looked like an expensive striker and then a bunch of younger players, that's probably what we're looking at. And then maybe a year or two down the line, Bruno gets towards the end of this contract. We have to think about replacing him because he is human, despite all evidence to the contrary that we're looking at on the pitch at the moment.
I think that's the play, right? Like, all of those factors that you've talked about. So the contract expiries, and then the 5 players that look most likely to be out the door. If you take the potential fees involved and the wages, total salary costs. So you include employer taxes on top of all of that sort of stuff. That then potentially frees up a war chest, which is more akin to what United have been spending in the past. Will they spend it all? Again, maybe, but I think it will be, or I hope it will be, a lot smarter than what has been done in the past. You're getting rid of potentially their like 8 to 9 players off your books. Okay, even if you've got a war chest of 150 to 200 million pounds, okay, you can subsidize some of those players with your likes of your Aiden Heavens or your Chido Obi's coming through. That's 7 players for 150 million. That's not including wages.
Yeah,
that's not a lot to play with.
No, I think that's right, and can't make the mistakes of the past, which was okay. Like, for example, let's just take Marcus Rashford. We sell Marcus Rashford for the option 40 million. If you in PSR terms, that's all on the books this year. You do the Beermat calculation and go, yeah, we can spend 120 million now because it's a 3-year PSR cycle. And that is the problems of the past, like stacked up right there. That 120 million pound player or 260 million pound players or whatever it is we think we could afford to buy with that better work out because you're not spending it in years 2 and years 3. And United basically like run that cycle for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's been a disaster.
Totally. And I've written quite extensively, like the Anthony and Casemiro window. If you just like forget the footballing side of it, just look at it financially. That was the tip of the iceberg in my eyes, and I genuinely still don't understand how those transfers could have been signed off in the way that they were.
Just incredible. I mean, very different transfers, but the Casemiro one, I think we were all looking at it going, bloody hell, 60 plus 10. Yeah. How long? And he was showing signs of physical wear and tear before coming. Anyone who'd watched Real Madrid could see that he was sort of being carried by the rest of that midfield, and that was like, Jesus. And then Anthony, I mean, Edward van der Sar just did a massive solid for Ajax there and screwed his old club. Like, incredible negations.
He did what he had to do.
He did what he had to do. Yeah. At least United split the actual cash over a few years rather than with Harry Maguire, where they paid it all up front.
Totally. I think like this summer, I've almost got like a traffic light system or a tiering system as to where I think funds are likely to be spent. And I think might be marquee signings, but I don't think it will be any more than £50 million on any of those quote unquote marquee players. You've got kind of high performing or signs of high performing talent, which are probably you're up to 30 million. So that's like your Dorgus.
Yeah.
And then you've got your kind of like real youth potentials, which are probably a little bit more speculative in nature, that could probably be anything up to about £10 million. So your Aiden Heavens, your Diego Leons probably fall into that sort of bucket. And I think bringing this round to kind of news flow this week, the Giovanni Quenda deal, I think when you look at the fees that Chelsea have paid, I think it was close to 50 million euros for him before add-ons.
Plus extras, yeah.
Yeah,
quite a lot of extras. Yeah, you can kind of look at that and go, I know everyone freaked out about it because we just made the assumption that it'd be coming in and he's a brilliant young player. But it is a number that United that would have been the marquee signing at those numbers that Chelsea are paying.
Exactly. And to your point, that falls into the risk of, are we just making the same mistakes again?
Yeah. It's an interesting one with Chelsea because they will almost certainly fail the UEFA PSR rule. UEFA have backed down after being having a good slapping from Manchester City in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. They now no longer want to fight with clubs, and they're just financial penalties. It's kind of a open book with UEFA. Yes, there are rules, but we're just going to fine you some money for spending too much money. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Premier League, obviously very different. There are teeth there. So, yeah, it's like we've seen with Everton and Forest, and Leicester were a loophole away from being deducted points as well. And then City hopefully have been sent back down to the Northern Premier League or wherever they'll be playing their football for the next few years.
Isn't everyone meant to stick to the facts on the City one, though?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Stick to that's all. Yeah. We don't know anything apart from hundreds of pages of leaked emails. Yeah.
It will be incredibly, when that decision drops, it will be incredibly interesting to see everything that then ensues. There's this point, even if the Premier League are quote unquote successful in improving their case, when you think about international TV rights, have they just discredited the last 10 years?
Yeah. It is a really dangerous situation for everyone involved, and City is certainly betting on the Premier League as a collective wanting to cave and not to punish the league as a collective too much, for sure. Well, we'll see where that independent panel gets to on that one very soon, I imagine. One thing I should say to everyone listening, and they'll know this anyway, but whatever comes out in the news first, don't believe it, because City will spin this first. The Premier League will not be fighting a media war. They'll go with the facts of the case, but City will spin it. And so we'll get stories by City's favourite journalists in the Mail and the Times saying, minor punishment, but they've won on the blah, 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 blah sections. Because there will be some sections where, you broke those rules and you didn't break those rules. You're on the border with this rule, and we're going to get the guilty or not guilty first and then the punishment later. And it's going to leave a lot of room for spinning this, I imagine.
Totally. And I think probably a long appeal process, regardless of which way the hammer falls.
Yeah. Let them appeal while playing in the Sunday League somewhere is my view of these. But hey, I would be a cruel judge, but I would love to be on that panel. Wow. Yeah. Oh, sorry. What? You're nuking the Etihad? Yes.
Yeah.
I think we may have come to the end of our agenda. We are planning to do this, every couple of weeks, depending on schedules or news that comes out. Maybe we'll drop the odd emergency one if there's something big happens in the world of United's finances.
Definitely. Sounds good.
And if Sir Jim would like to come on, or what's he called? Cliff Batty? No, he was the old CFO. Who's the Roger Bell? Roger Bell, yeah. Ineos old hand. If he'd like to come on the show and explain the financials, you're welcome, Roger.
Yeah, or Omar, any of them.
Yeah,
we'll gladly have them on.
Very good, Jamie. Subprime Goals on Twitter. It's been a pleasure to talk to you for this nearly hour of financial chat.
Likewise, thanks a lot, Ed, and see everyone next time.
Bye now.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.